When you go to the supermarket, why is the cashier most of the time a woman and the manager a man? Same thing when you ask a secretary for a business or a medical appointment. Why is the secretary almost always a woman and the person she works for most of the time a man? Even in French language, the designations cashier and secretary are feminine. Une caissière, une secrétaire, opposed to boss, which is masculine, un patron. That means in French people's mind, those positions refer to female jobs, whereas men are more expected to deal with running a business or driving a team. So as it will be discussed later, those power position distribution differences are not specific to one particular country. That trend has always been observed throughout history and is kind of worldwide nowadays. So let's take it now from the US perspectives, where by giving some figures, potential reasons, and even future estimations about the distribution of men and women in power positions. So nowadays, in the US, women are 50.8% of the US population. They are 47% of the labor force. They earn 60% of both undergraduate and master's degrees in several fields: law, medicine, management, business. And yet, despite all those great numbers, there are only 14.6% of executive officers. This is a huge gap, and for example, in the financial industry, they make up 54% of the labor force, but only 12% of them are executive officers. Same thing in healthcare, where they account for 78% of the workforce, but there are only 14.6% of executive officers. In IT, they hold only 9% of management positions, and eventually in policy, there are only 10% of governors, they make up 12% of the mayors, and there are only 20% of the US senators. So from now on, let's try to find some reasons about this huge gap between the distribution of men and women in power positions. In my opinion, this can mainly be explained by two things. First, the woman's evolution in the workforce through history, and second, their involvement in family care. So let's first start talking about the history in the US of women at work. So let's go back in the 19th century. At that time, women started out working in the US. They were usually working in textile mills, in garment shops, where the conditions of work were quite hard for women because those jobs were pretty exhausting and pretty exhaustive and quite repetitive. But as at that time women were considered weaker than men, those jobs were supposed to make men's tasks easier. So women weren't allowed to take any decision, but just applying and executing the tasks they were asked to. So then, throughout decades, their conditions at work got a little bit better. They finally became allowed to attend studies in higher universities in the US from 1900. So from that time, that has improved drastically their conditions at work and even the positions they were occupying within a company. Step by step, they became secretary, accountant, teller. But as they've always been trained to do that kind of but one specific job for a living, it's been hard for them to take over people's mindsets and even earn men's confidence about higher responsibility top jobs. Moreover, and as a consequence, it's pretty unusual nowadays to see a woman leading a male team. Some men are not used to being led by a woman, so some of them wouldn't even listen to their directives, their advice, their criticism. So only a few would dare to hire a woman as a manager or as a chief executive, no matter how skilled that woman might be. Anyway, it wouldn't necessarily be because of the skills of a woman, but most of the time because of the environment and the atmosphere that woman would be working in. And secondly, until some years ago, women got married and had their first child quite young. As you can see, in 1980, women got married and had their first child in the US on average at the age of 22, which is quite young. And it didn't leave them the time to set within a company and advance within that particular company. And after becoming a mom, women have tended to take more care about their children and their family, rather than taking care of their career and aiming to advance within a company and take more responsibilities. That has break their ambition and retained them from growing on the company ladder. And that also explains why nowadays some recruiters would rather hire a young man than a young woman. Because let's say a young woman gets pregnant after only 2 weeks working in a particular company. If she gets pregnant, that means she would be away from work for many months, up to a few years. So that wouldn't be interesting for a company. So that's why some recruiters would rather hire someone who would be available all the time. That means young men. So how about the future in the US? On the one hand, one can be optimistic about women turning over that unfair trend and balance out the distribution of men and women in power positions. Indeed, more and more women, as we said, attend long studies because they earn even more undergraduate and master's degrees than men. Besides, nowadays, American women are waiting longer than ever to have their first child. So on average, they get married and have their first child at the age of 28. So it leaves them the time to improve their position within a company. On the other hand, though, one recent example is Hillary Clinton running for the 2016 US presidential elections. So first, this is a huge step forward for women being respected on the distribution in leadership. But unfortunately, too many people, and even women themselves, refuse to vote for her because of her gender, in spite of her policy skills. And eventually, it's hard to provide some solutions to balance out the distribution of men and women in power positions. But nowadays, many companies set up quotas to hire women and to make them fit on a work team with men. So that means companies must hire women in their teams. And as it was said, women study more and more, and they assign more importance to their careers, so they can access to power positions easier than they used to and quicker than they used to. So personally, I think now everything is setting up, and women have almost all the ingredients to balance out that distribution. It's just going to take some time, in my opinion. Indeed, a long time, because many experts foresee that 50-50 trend, that 50-50 balance to be reached in 2075.